That shoe told me everything they were trying to hide. You know I can't take this. Just think of your son. It's for his future. We need to leave, now!
Her shoe came off. That was the detail that stopped everything. Not the sound of the old woman crying out. Not the crash of coffee cups jumping off the table. Not even the sight of a man dragging a 75-year-old woman across a diner floor by her wrist like she was a piece of luggage he was tired of carrying. It was the shoe. One pale beige flat worn soft at the heel, spinning slowly on the linoleum as the woman's sock foot dragged past it, left behind, forgotten, like she already was. 20 people in the Ironwood diner on a slow Tuesday morning in November watched it happen. 20 grown adults with coffee going cold in front of them and eggs getting stiff on their plates. Truckers, a retired couple near the window. 2 men in county road department jackets arguing about something that didn't matter anymore. A young woman with a toddler in a booster seat, the child banging a spoon against the tray like it was the best game in the world. 20 people, and not one of them stood up. Forks stopped halfway to mouths, eyes dropped to plates. Someone near the back cleared their throat like they needed the sound to fill the space where a decision should have been. In the far corner booth, a man sat with a mug of black coffee and a plate of eggs he hadn't touched in 2 minutes. His name was Vance Holden. He was 52 years old. He had a face that had been through weather most men don't survive a neck thick as a fence post, and hands that were scarred at the knuckles in ways that didn't come from working in an office. He wore a leather cut over a dark gray thermal, the kind of cut that meant something on any road in America, wings stitched across the back in thread that had gone dull from years of highway sun. Hell's Angels. The patch alone had cleared rooms before. Vance sat very still. He had driven 14 miles that morning on a black Harley with chrome gone dull from 1,000 trips down roads that don't have names. He came to the Ironwood every Tuesday, ordered the same thing every time, ate alone, didn't bother anyone, didn't look for conversation. Just needed 2 hours of quiet and a cup of coffee that stayed hot, and then he'd ride back out and the day would take care of itself. He was not supposed to be anyone's problem. He was not supposed to be anyone's answer either. But he was watching. He had been watching since the bell above the door rang 20 minutes ago and the old woman walked in. She came in slow, the way people move when every step costs something. Gray hair pulled back in a careful bun, a thin cardigan the color of old lavender, 2 sizes too large for her frame. She held one arm pressed close against her ribs, the way you hold yourself when something underneath is cracked and breathing too deep reminds you. The bruise on her left cheekbone was fresh, purple at the center going yellow at the edges. Her bottom lip had a split in it that hadn't fully closed. Her name was Winifred Gallagher. Winnie to the people who knew her, Dottie Weaver, the woman behind the counter, who had worked that same stretch of Formica for 19 years, knew her. Said her name soft when she came in, the way you say a name when you're trying to tell someone they're safe without actually saying the words. Winnie tried to smile back, couldn't quite manage it, lowered herself into a booth like she was made of something that could break. Around her neck on a thin silver chain hung a pair of military dog tags, old ones, the metal worn dull from years of being touched. A man's name stamped into the surface, the letters going smooth from decades of a thumb running over them in the dark. The tags belonged to Harold Gallagher, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Harold had been gone since 2009, 15 years. Winnie had worn his tags every day since the morning the men in dress uniforms came to her door. Vance noticed the tags. He noticed everything always had. 2 tours in Iraq-Fallujah in 2004 and again in 2005 had rewired the part of his brain that was supposed to let things go unobserved. You come back from places like that and the switch never fully turns off. You notice where the exits are. You notice who's sitting with their back to the door and who isn't. You notice when someone's holding themselves like they've been hurt and trying to hide it. He noticed Dottie lean across the counter and ask Winnie something in a voice too low to carry. He noticed Winnie shake her head and look down at her tea. He noticed the way her hands shook when she lifted the cup. And he stayed in his seat. Because it wasn't his business yet. Because a man with an active 18-month suspended sentence for assault in the Commonwealth of Kentucky had very little room to make other people's problems his own. Because he had learned the hard way several times over that the impulse to wade into other people's pain had a cost, and that cost had a way of landing on people who couldn't afford it. So he watched, and he waited, and he ate 2 bites of his eggs. The bell rang again. The man who walked in wore a pressed Oxford shirt the color of dried mustard and slacks with a crease you could shave with. He was somewhere around 40, with the soft hands of someone who had never done physical labor, and the eyes of someone who had made a career out of understanding exactly how much a person could be pushed before they pushed back. He carried a leather folder under one arm, the professional kind, the kind that said, "I have paperwork, and paperwork has weight." His name was Ferris Pruitt, and the moment he stepped through the door, every bit of color drained out of Winnie Gallagher's face. She knew him. That was clear before he'd taken 3 steps. Her hands went flat on the table. Her chin dropped. She became very small in her booth in the way that people become small when they've spent time being made to feel that way. Pruitt scanned the room with the casual ownership of a man who has never had to look for threats, found Winnie, and walked straight to her. He didn't sit. He stood over her booth with one hand flat on the table and leaned in, talking low. Too low for most of the room to catch. But Vance could read the shape of it. The set of Pruitt's jaw, the way Winnie kept shaking her head, the single word she said back barely audible. No. Pruitt's voice came up just enough to carry then. He said she had signed. He said it was legal. He said she was coming with him today, whether she liked it or not, and that it would be a lot easier if she just got up and walked out on her own. And Winnie said it again, louder this time, loud enough that the whole diner could hear it over the hiss of the coffee machine and the sound of the toddler banging his spoon. I didn't understand what it was. You told me it was for the medicine. I never agreed to give you my home. Pruitt reached into the folder, pulled out a document dense with small print, and slapped it down on the table in front of her. A signature line at the bottom, and her handwriting scratched across it in the shaky cursive of someone whose hands don't always do what she asks anymore. You signed it, he said. Your house is ours. You don't get to change your mind. He grabbed her wrist. She came halfway out of the booth before she could get her feet under her. Her tea went sideways across the table, ran off the edge, hit the floor. She grabbed at the seat back with her free hand, but he was too strong, and she was too small. Her hip caught the corner of the table. She cried out a small, broken sound, the sound of someone who has learned that crying out too loud has consequences. Her foot dragged. The shoe came off. Vance looked at it. One pale beige flat, worn soft at the heel, sitting alone on the linoleum floor, while its owner was dragged away from it. And then he saw the other shoe, still on Winnie's foot, dragging across the floor. It was gray, not beige, not the same color, not the same shoe at all. He sat very still for one full second. He was not in the Ironwood Diner anymore. He was in the kitchen of a house in Louisville on a morning in October 2011, and his son David was 9 years old and getting ready for school, and David had come downstairs wearing one blue sneaker and one white one because he had gotten dressed in the dark, moving quiet through the hallway, not wanting to wake his father up, because his father had come home late and loud the night before, and in that house in those years, late and loud meant something that a 9-year-old boy had learned to navigate by staying invisible. David had mismatched shoes because he was afraid of Vance. That was the truth of it, not the softened version, not the version Vance had told himself in the years since. The plain truth, which was that his son had learned to get dressed in the dark as a survival strategy, and Vance had been so far inside his own wreckage that he hadn't seen it until the morning he stood in a diner in Harlan County, Kentucky, and a stranger's shoe fell off her foot and landed on a linoleum floor. 3 weeks after that October morning, David was gone. A car Vance wasn't driving the road. Vance wasn't on an afternoon Vance wasn't present for because he was serving 60 days in county for a bar fight that had finally put him over whatever line the court had drawn. Gone at 9 years old. Gone while Vance was somewhere else being the person he had always eventually become. He had been trying to outrun that morning for 13 years. He looked at the shoe on the floor. He knew what standing up was going to chart on, the suspended sentence, the probation terms, the careful distance he had worked to maintain between himself and exactly this kind of situation. He knew all of it in the 2 seconds he sat there before he made his decision. He made it anyway, because he had run out of ways to look away from a pair of mismatched shoes. Vance set down his coffee, stood up, all of him, 6'1" of quiet and scar tissue and 13 years of trying to be something worth being. The booth creaked under him as he rose, and that sound was the loudest thing in the room. "Let her go," he said. 2 words. Quiet, flat. The kind of quiet that isn't soft. The kind that comes from a place so settled it doesn't need volume. Pruitt stopped. Still holding Winnie's wrist, he turned and looked at Vance the way men like Pruitt look at obstacles. He took in the size of him. He took in the leather cut, the patch, the general architecture of someone who had absorbed a great deal of damage over a long life and was still standing. He did the math, and then he made the wrong call. "Mind your own business," he said. "This is a private matter." Vance stepped out from behind the table. One step, then another. Unhurried. He moved the way men move when they have already made their decision and they're just covering the distance between where they are and where they need to be. "That woman," Vance said, "is wearing a dead Marine's tags, and you've got her by the arm like she's something you own. So I'm going to say it one more time." He stopped. Close now, close enough that Pruitt had to look up. "Let her go." For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Pruitt let go. Winnie's wrist dropped free. She stumbled, and Vance was there, hands on her shoulders, steadying her on her feet. He guided her back to the booth, eased her down, with the kind of care you use with something fragile, something that has already been dropped once today and can't afford to be dropped again. He went down on one knee, picked up the shoe from the floor, slid it back onto her foot without comment, without making it into anything more than what it was, a practical thing that needed doing. He waved to Dottie behind the counter. "Water," he said, "and maybe some more hot tea." Dottie moved, like the room had been waiting for someone to move first. Vance sat down across from Winnie. Her hands were shaking badly enough that he kept his own loose and visible on the table so she could see them. Not a threat, just hands. Just a person sitting across from her in a diner in November. "You're all right now," he said. "You're all right." She looked at him across the table. The bruise dark on her cheek, the split lip. A woman who had learned that help doesn't come and who was still in the process of understanding that today it had. Pruitt was still standing there, not gone, not satisfied, the kind of man who mistakes his own embarrassment for a reason to escalate. He straightened his shirt, adjusted the folder under his arm, started to say something. He didn't get the chance. The bell rang again. This time it wasn't one man. The man who walked in first was older, mid-60s, silver hair cut short and neat, gray suit well-fitted, the kind that gets made rather than bought, shoes that cost more than most of the cars in the parking lot. His face was the kind of face that got elected to things that coached Little League on Saturdays and said the right things at the right dinners and smiled in photographs in a way that made people feel reassured. He walked through a room the way certain men walk, with the assumption that the room will arrange itself around him. His name was Silas Croft. Behind him came 3 men in jackets that didn't button all the way. The kind of jackets you don't button all the way when you want people to understand what's underneath. And behind all of them came a 5th man younger with a badge clipped to his belt and the specific posture of someone who was being paid to look official rather than to be it. Deputy Foster Raines. The badge was real. Everything else about him was Croft's money. Croft walked to the center of the diner and stopped. He looked around the room slowly, took inventory of every face the way a man takes inventory of a property he already owns. Then he gave a small nod to the man nearest the door, who flipped the deadbolt and changed the sign in the window from open to closed. The lock clicked, and the whole feeling of the room changed. This wasn't a conflict anymore. This was a situation. There is a difference between the two, and every person in that diner felt it simultaneously, the way a drop in pressure tells you the storm has arrived. "Folks," Croft said, and his voice was warm in the practiced way of a man who had spent decades perfecting warmth as a tool. "I apologize for the disruption. My associate handled a private matter poorly. We're just going to get that sorted, and then everyone can go back to their morning." He turned to Winnie, and the warmth in his voice dropped into something that was still polite in its shape, but cold at its core. "Mrs. Gallagher, you're going to come with us now. You're going to do it quietly. There are a lot of people in this room who have nothing to do with this, and I would genuinely hate for anyone to be inconvenienced by what happens next." The threat was in the architecture of the sentence. He wasn't threatening Winnie. He was gesturing at everyone else in the room. He was saying clearly and completely that the 20 people in this diner were now part of the equation, whether they wanted to be or not. One of Croft's men pulled his jacket back just far enough. Deputy Raines shifted his weight so the badge caught the light. The message landed. You don't need to announce it when the room already understands. The trucker stopped pretending to eat. The retired couple near the window went absolutely still. The young woman, Lena Briggs, 29 years old, pulled her 2-year-old son in against her chest. Her other hand moved to the phone on the table beside her. Croft opened the leather briefcase. Not one contract. 47, stacked in order, paper-clipped in groups. Deeds and powers of attorney and signature pages and documents with the header of a company called Croft Senior Relief, LLC, established in the Commonwealth of Kentucky in 2017, and operated continuously since a machine that had been running for 7 years and had never once slowed down. The names on those documents were the names of people like Winnie Gallagher, old people, alone people, people whose families lived far away or didn't call as often as they should, people who had opened the door to a man with a soft voice and a leather folder because he had mentioned their dead husband's name or their dead wife's name and used it like a key. Vance read the top 3 documents before Croft closed the case. He understood the whole shape of it in the time it took to read 43 words. Croft reached into his jacket and then set a fold of cash on the table in front of Vance, thick as a deck of cards. $5,000 on the laminate, placed without theatrics, like a man making a simple business proposition. You're a practical man, Croft said. Finish your breakfast. Get on your bike. Forget this morning happened. Everyone goes home safe. Vance looked at the money. Then he looked at Winnie Gallagher, at the bruise on her cheek, at the dog tags resting against her sternum, at the name stamped into that worn metal. Sergeant Harold Gallagher, USMC. He thought about a shoe on a linoleum floor, about a boy who got dressed in the dark, about the specific weight of looking away from something you should have seen. Keep it, Vance said. You can't buy what I'm standing on. Something behind Croft's eyes went flat and old. He gave a small gesture with 2 fingers. His 3 men started moving. What happened next was not dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. It was brief and decisive and conducted entirely in the language of physics. The first man came at Vance fast with a wide right hand. Vance turned his head just enough and caught the wrist on the way through and used the man's own forward motion to introduce his face to the edge of the counter. The man sat down on the floor and did not get back up. The second grabbed a chair and raised it overhead. Vance stepped inside the arc before it could come down and drove his elbow into the man's midsection. The chair clattered, a short hook to the jaw, and the second man joined the first. The third looked at his 2 colleagues on the floor. Looked at Vance. Did the math the other 2 had not done in time. He stepped back. You sure, Vance asked him quietly? He was not sure. Pruitt wasn't done. His judgment had been overruled by his embarrassment, which is the most dangerous combination in a man who has never been truly stopped before. He grabbed a steak knife from the nearest table and came in low and fast, going for Vance's ribs. Vance shifted his hips, caught the wrist with both hands, and turned it in a direction wrists are not designed to go. The knife hit the floor. Pruitt screamed. Vance walked him backward by that broken wrist calm as a man parking a car and deposited him into an empty booth. Stay, Vance said. Pruitt stayed. That left Croft and Deputy Raines. Raines reached for the gun on his hip, got it unsnapped, did not draw it, because Vance was looking at him with a specific kind of steadiness that had nothing of fear in it and everything of certainty. Son, Vance said, I've had guns pointed at me in places you can't find on a map. You pull that trigger in a locked diner in front of 20 witnesses with a bought badge on your belt, and you will spend the rest of your life explaining this morning to a federal prosecutor. Every single person in this room sees your face right now. Raines' hand stopped, because Vance was right. The whole scheme worked in the shadows on people who were alone and frightened and had been taught that no one was coming. It did not work in a room full of witnesses in broad daylight with a phone already recording. Vance glanced across the diner at Lena Briggs. She hadn't run. She hadn't gotten under the table with her son. She was sitting exactly where she had been when Croft locked the door. Her phone was in her hand and the small red indicator light was on. She had been recording from the moment the sign flipped to closed. Not shaking, not afraid in the way that stops people. Waiting, like she had been building toward exactly this. Vance held her gaze for 1 second. He turned back to Croft. Go ahead, he said. Tell her about the system again. I don't think she caught the first part. Croft looked at the phone. He looked at Rains, who took the badge off his belt and set it on the counter and walked to the door and let himself out without a word. He looked at his men on the floor, at Pruitt cradling his broken wrist in the booth, at 20 people who were no longer looking at their plates. Slowly, Croft reached down for the briefcase. Leave it, Vance said. That Croft said is my property. That Vance said is evidence. And you're going to walk out of here without it and hope the real police get to you before everyone in this room decides to make some calls. A long moment, the kind that stretches. Then Croft's fingers opened. The briefcase dropped to the floor. He straightened his jacket, walked to the door without looking back. The bell gave a crooked, half-torn sound as it swung shut behind him. The diner let out a breath, all of it all at once. People moved. The retired man near the window stood up and went to check on Winnie. Dottie came around the counter with ice wrapped in a clean dish towel and pressed it gently to the old woman's cheek. One of the truckers righted the chair that had been knocked over, setting it back on its feet like putting the room itself back in order. Vance stood in the middle of the ironwood diner and looked at his hands. The scarred knuckles, the inside of his left wrist, the name tattooed there in plain block letters, black ink gone slightly blue from years and sun. David. He had stood up in this diner because of a pair of mismatched shoes and because he had run out of ways to be the man who looked away. Whether that made him anything other than a man who was tired of being that other version of himself, he couldn't yet say. He walked back to Winnie's booth and sat down across from her. Her hands had stopped shaking badly enough to hold the glass of water Dottie had brought. She took a sip, set it down, looked at Vance across the table. Thank you, she whispered. You're all right now, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, the bruise dark on her cheek, the split lip. A woman who had learned that help doesn't come sitting across from a man who had just reminded her that sometimes it does. Why didn't you look away? She asked. Everyone else did. He thought about the shoe, about David in the kitchen doorway in October 2011, about the specific cost of looking away from things you should have seen years before you finally see them. I recognized something he said simply. He didn't explain it further. She didn't ask him to. The real police came, the ones whose badges were still their own. Vance gave his statement, plain and short. Lena Briggs handed her phone to a detective with steady hands and a look on her face that said she had been building toward this day for longer than this morning. The third of Croft's men sat quietly in a booth with his hands visible and waited. The Detective Sergeant Patricia Weaver looked at the stack of documents from Croft's briefcase and went very still for a moment before she looked up at Vance. Do you know who Silas Croft is? She asked. No, Vance said. She looked back at the documents. You will, she said. He paid for both their meals and left enough extra that Dottie wouldn't be short for the trouble the morning had caused her. He nodded to the room. Then he looked at Winnie. I need to know some things, he said, about the man who came to your door, about how it started. I need you to tell me everything you remember. She looked at him steadily. This woman who had spent 3 months being afraid and had somehow come through it, still sitting upright. All right, she said. Outside, the November sun moved slow across the parking lot. The Harley sat against the curb patient as everything it had already waded through. The highway ran long in both directions, and somewhere down one end of it, Silas Croft was driving away from a diner with 47 pieces of paper left behind on a floor, understanding for the first time that the system he had built and relied on for 7 years had just developed a problem he had not anticipated. The problem had a name he didn't know yet. Silas Croft was out by 4 in the afternoon. Vance heard it from Sergeant Weaver, who called him on the cell number he had written on his statement. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering news they had been dreading since they first understood what was in that briefcase. Judge Alton Greer signed the release order, she said. Personal recognizance. No bail required. Vance was sitting on the tailgate of a borrowed truck outside the Ironwood parking lot when the call came. He had been there since the police finished with him, just sitting with the cold coming in through his jacket, while he thought through the shape of what he was dealing with. He asked Weaver if she knew Greer. She was quiet for a moment. That was its own answer. Everybody in this county knows Alton Greer, she said finally. Vance thanked her and hung up. He sat a while longer. The highway ran quiet in both directions. A couple of cars passed. A semi going west. The sky had gone the color of old tin, and the temperature was dropping the way it drops in Kentucky in November, not gradually, but in steps like someone turning down a dial. He thought about a machine that had been running for 7 years. 7 years of soft voices and leather folders and forms that looked like one thing and were another. 7 years of people like Winnie Gallagher opening their front doors because a man with a pleasant face had used their dead husband's name in just the right tone of voice. A machine like that doesn't run on one man, it runs on a system, on a judge who signs what he's told to sign, on a deputy who closes complaint files before they can accumulate weight, on a lawyer who designs contracts clean enough to hold up in court and complicated enough that a 75-year-old woman with shaking hands doesn't understand what she's agreeing to, on a doctor who runs free health screenings for seniors and quietly writes prescriptions for things that soften the edges of a person's judgment. Croft was the face, but the machine had a lot of moving parts. Vance drove to Winnie's house. She lived 12 minutes from the Ironwood off a county road that the state had stopped maintaining sometime in the previous decade. The house was small and white with green shutters painted carefully sometime in the last few years. A porch with 2 chairs, a garden along the front that had been put to bed for winter, mulched and covered, and waiting for spring with the patience of something that had been through winters before and expected to come through this one too. Harold had bought it with Winnie in 1983. 41 years. 2 of their children had been born here. One of them had learned to walk on that porch. Harold had come home to it from overseas twice and had understood each time Winnie told him later that the house was the reason he had to come home. Vance sat at her kitchen table and drank the coffee she made without asking if he wanted any. She sat across from him with her hands around her own mug and told him everything. Her voice stayed level throughout the particular levelness of someone who has rehearsed the worst parts alone many times and knows exactly where the hard spots are. In August, she said, 3 months ago, he came to the door on a Tuesday morning, said his name was with Croft Senior Relief, said they had a program for the widows and families of veterans, said the county had a backlog of unclaimed medical benefits and he wanted to make sure she wasn't leaving anything on the table. He knew Harold's name. He knew his rank, he knew his unit and the year he deployed, and the action he was cited for in 1987. He said Harold would have wanted her taken care of. She stopped there, just for a moment. That's how he got through the door, she said. He used Harold's name like he knew him. She told him about the forms. 3 visits over 6 weeks. Each time Pruitt brought more paperwork. Each time he had an explanation for every page that made it sound routine. There had been a notary at the second visit, a woman who had come with Pruitt and sat at this same kitchen table and watched Winnie sign and said nothing about what the documents actually said. Between the second and third visits, a Dr. Clifton Marsh had called. The county was running a free health screening for seniors over 70 at a church hall in town. Winnie went. There were a dozen other older people there. The doctor was pleasant and thorough. At the end of the appointment, he gave her a sample bottle of something he said would help with the anxiety that came from living alone. Take one in the morning, he said. Just a small thing. She took the pills for 6 weeks, until the morning she woke up and the fog she had been moving through since August finally lifted enough for her to sit down with a dictionary and look up the word conveyance, which appeared 4 times in the documents she had kept in the kitchen drawer. He asked her what she found. She looked at her coffee. I found that I had signed my house over to a company I had never heard of, she said, for $1. $1 consideration. That's what it said. That's the value they put on 41 years. She said it without tears, without a tremor. The way you say a thing when you've had 3 months to move from the shock of it to the cold, settled fact of it. Vance looked at her hands on the mug. Did you keep the forms, he asked. She stood up without answering and went to the bedroom. She came back with a phone. Old Samsung cracked at the corner. Harold's phone, she said. The one she had kept charged because getting rid of it had felt like losing something she wasn't ready to lose. She opened the photo library and handed it to Vance. There were 217 photographs. Taken between August and November of this year, every visit from Pruitt had been documented. Every form, every page, every envelope. There were photographs of Pruitt's car in her driveway with a clear shot of the license plate. There were photographs of the church hall where Marsh had held the screening, of the sample pill bottle with the label visible, of envelopes with return addresses, of documents laid flat on her kitchen table in the afternoon light, shot carefully every page in sequence. Vance scrolled through them slowly. He thought about what it cost this woman to do this, to be afraid to know something terrible was being done to her, and to respond not with helplessness, but with the quiet, methodical work of gathering proof. While her hands shook, while the fog of whatever Marsh had given her sat heavy on her mornings, while Pruitt kept coming back to her front door with his leather folder and Harold's name in his mouth. She had done all of this alone in silence with a dead man's phone. He looked up at her. "This is going to matter," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I just needed someone who knew what to do with it." He drove back to the highway and made a call. Axel Donovan picked up on the second ring. 58 years old, 11 years as a financial crimes investigator before a knee injury changed the direction of his life and eventually brought him into the chapter. Vance explained what he had: the photographs, the company name, the judge, the timeline, the doctor. He gave Axel the facts in the order they had happened and let him do what he did with them. "I will need the photos," Axel said. "I will get them to you tonight." "Give me 48 hours, Axel said. Vance drove to the address Lena Briggs had given him. She lived in a rental on the east side of town, a two-bedroom that was clean and carefully kept, and too small, in the way that places are too small when the person living in them deserves more room than circumstances have allowed. Her son Owen was on the kitchen floor with a toy truck when Vance arrived, pushing it back and forth along a crack in the linoleum with the serious concentration of someone conducting important work. Lena had coffee ready. She sat down across from him and told her side without waiting to be asked. Her father was Harlan Briggs, 71 years old, 32 years in the Harlan County coal mines before his back gave out. He had lived in the same house on Crawford Road since 1979, a three-bedroom he had built a second porch onto in 1995 because Lena's mother had always wanted one. Her mother died in 1998, 3 years after the porch was finished. She got 8 summers on it. Harlan had kept the porch painted and the railing tight every year since. Ferris Pruitt had come to Harlan's door in February of this year. Same approach, same soft voice, same careful research. Harlan's wife had had a brother who served, and Pruitt had known that too. Harlan signed in March. He didn't tell Lena until May, by which time the transfer had been processed, and a letter had arrived informing him that Croft Senior Relief LLC was the property owner of record, and he had 90 days to arrange alternative housing. Lena had gone to the county sheriff's office in May. Deputy Raines took her statement, thanked her politely, and closed the case within 48 hours. No explanation, no return call. She went back in June. Same result. In August, she filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's tip line. She was told it had been received and that someone would follow up. No one did. In September, she started following Ferris Pruitt. Not confrontationally, just watching, learning his patterns, learning which diners he used for meetings, which days he drove, which routes, who he met with, and where. She had been doing it for 5 weeks when she walked into the Ironwood that Tuesday morning with Owen in his booster seat and ordered pancakes and waited. Vance looked at her across the table. "You have a 2-year-old, he said. She looked at him without apology. "My father is living in a rented room the size of a closet," she said. "He built that house. He built the second porch himself. He kept it because my mother wanted it, and she has been gone for 26 years. That's what they took. So yes, I have a 2-year-old, and yes, I was there anyway." Vance said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I need everything you know about Raines closing those files." She slid a folder across the table. She had been keeping notes for months. He spent an hour reading them. When he was done, he looked at her. "You know about Judge Greer," he said. She nodded. "You know how deep it goes." "Deep enough," she said. "Greer has been on the bench in this county for 14 years. Croft Senior Relief has been operating for 7. You do that math and you understand that Greer wasn't something Croft found after he built his system. Greer was part of the architecture from the beginning." Vance drove to see Harlan Briggs. The old man lived in a room above a hardware store on the south end of Main Street. Second floor, one window facing the alley. Vance knocked and Harlan answered in a flannel shirt and work pants that were too big at the waist, the kind of too big that comes from a man who has stopped eating the way he used to because the reasons for it have been taken from him. 71 years old. face like a topographic map of every hard thing he had survived, eyes that were not defeated but that had settled into a kind of exhausted patience, like a man who had stopped expecting the thing he was waiting for to arrive. They sat in the two chairs in the room. There wasn't anywhere else to sit. No kitchen table, just two chairs and a bed and a small shelf with 4 photographs on it. One of Lena at her high school graduation, one of Owen, 2 of a woman who had to be Lena's mother. Vance told him what he knew. The 47 contracts, Judge Greer, Foster Raines, Dwight Paxson, the lawyer whose name appeared on every document as drafting attorney, Dr. Clifton Marsh, and the prescriptions. What Axel was going to start pulling apart tonight. Harlan listened without interrupting. His hands were still in his lap, the hands of a man who had spent 32 years doing work that cost everything. When Vance finished, Harlan was quiet. Then he said, "I signed it. That's on me." "No, sir," Vance said. "That's on them." Harlan looked at the shelf, at the photographs. "The second porch," he said. "I put it up in '95. Used lumber from a job site they were clearing. Took me 4 weekends. Dorothy sat on the steps the whole time I was working, just watching. She said she liked watching me build things." He stopped. "She died 3 years after I finished it. She got 8 summers on that porch. I kept it up because she wanted it, painted it every 4 years, kept the railing tight." He looked at his hands. "I don't know what condition it's in now," he said. Vance sat with that and didn't try to fill it with anything. Some things don't get better from being talked around. After a while, he said, "I need you to trust me for a few more days." Harlan looked at him. "Are you going to get my house back?" he asked. "I'm going to try," Vance said. Harlan nodded. Once. The nod of a man who has spent a lifetime understanding that trying is all anyone can honestly promise, and that it is enough to go on. Vance sent Winnie's photographs to Axel that night. He sat at his own kitchen table and looked at nothing in particular for a while. The quiet of a house that has only ever had one person in it settled around him. He thought about David, about the October morning and the mismatched shoes and all the years he had spent trying to find a way to carry what he had done and what he had failed to do. He had been doing it by staying small, by keeping to the corner booth with his back to the wall, by eating his eggs and drinking his coffee and riding out before anything could become his problem. He thought about Winnie's kitchen, about the 217 photographs on a dead man's phone, about a woman who had been afraid for 3 months and had spent those 3 months fighting back the only way she knew how, in silence with a cracked Samsung and a pair of working eyes and more courage than most men he had ever met. He fell asleep at the table, woke at 2 in the morning and went to bed. Axel called at 6 the next morning, with 40 hours of work in his voice and the specific quality of a man who has found what he went looking for. Vance listened for 32 minutes. When Axel finished, Vance asked one question. "Can you prove it, all of it?" Axel said. "If we get the right prosecutor." "Not local," Vance said. "Not local," Axel agreed. Vance called Lena. She answered before the second ring. "I need you to find a federal prosecutor in this district who has nothing to do with Alton Greer," he said. "Someone who owes nothing to this county." She was quiet for a moment. "I went to law school for 2 years before Owen happened," she said. "I still have contacts." "Use them," Vance said. He drove to Winnie's house early that afternoon. He found the car before he reached the porch. All 4 tires flat to the rims, the old Ford sitting low and lopsided in the driveway like something that had given up. He pulled in behind it and got out and walked around the car slowly. The valves on every tire had been turned. Someone had done it quietly in the night, taken their time, made sure the job was complete. He looked at the windshield. A piece of paper was tucked under the wiper blade. He pulled it out, read it, drop it or she doesn't make it to court. He stood in Winnie's driveway in the cold morning air and read the note twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He went to the front door and knocked. Winnie answered in her cardigan with her hands already going toward her throat to find the dog tags which she had put back on after giving her statement the day before. Her face when she saw Vance told him she already knew about the car. She had heard something in the night and looked out the window and seen the tires and had been waiting for morning to call someone, not wanting to call in the dark, not wanting to be afraid out loud in the dark. "I know," he said before she could speak. "I saw. Come inside." They sat at her kitchen table. He told her what was coming: the prosecutor, the warrants, what would be required of her, that she would need to leave the house for a day or two, and that he was going to personally make sure she got where she needed to go and got back. She listened with her hands flat on the table. "Are you sure this will work?" she asked. He thought about Axel's 40 hours, about Lena's video, about 217 photographs taken in secret over 3 months by a woman who refused to give up. "As sure as I have been about anything in a long time," he said. She nodded. Then she picked up the phone and called her daughter. He went out to the porch and sat in Harold's chair and gave her the privacy of it. The garden waited under its winter cover. The fields ran out flat beyond the county road. He thought about a machine that had been running for 7 years and about the specific nature of things that run for a long time without being stopped. How they start to believe they will run forever. How that belief makes them careless in ways that matter. He thought about a note in his pocket. He thought about a woman who had spent 3 months taking photographs with a dead man's phone because she refused to accept that no one was coming. He sat in Harold's chair and waited. He drove Winnie to her daughter Carol's house in Cookeville, Tennessee on Thursday evening. The drive took an hour and 40 minutes. Winnie sat in the passenger seat with Harold's dog tags in her hand, not wearing them, just holding them, and the highway ran out ahead of the headlights through country that had gone dark and bare. She didn't talk much. He didn't push her to. Carol met them on the porch of her house. Late 40s, her mother's eyes, her father's jaw. She held Winnie for a long time before she looked up at Vance. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, gave her his number, told her he would call when it was safe to come back. He drove back to Harlan County in the dark, and the note sat folded in his jacket pocket the whole way. When he got home, he found a second piece of paper on his own porch step, weighted down by a stone so it wouldn't blow away. Someone had wanted to make sure he found it. 4 words in block letters. "We know about David." He stood on his own porch and read it and felt something move through him that was not fear exactly, but was adjacent to it. Not for himself, for a 9-year-old boy who had been gone for 13 years and whose name was now being used by strangers as a lever. He put the note in his pocket with the other one. Then he went inside and called Axel. "We need to move faster," he said. "How much faster?" "As fast as you can. And tell me what else you need." He was not going to let Silas Croft use David's name as a reason to stop. That was not something he was capable of allowing. Axel called back at 11 that night. The documents were finished. The full financial picture of Croft Senior Relief, LLC, traced from inception to the present. Shell companies in Delaware and Tennessee. A holding company that connected to a personal account in Alton Greer's name through 2 intermediate entities that were designed to be difficult to follow. A separate payment structure running to Foster Rains through a security consulting firm that had no other clients and no other work product. Dwight Paxton's firm billing hours to Croft entities at rates that could not be explained by any legitimate service. Dr. Clifton Marsh's practice receiving what were listed as referral fees from a wellness nonprofit registered to the address of a UPS store. 7 years, 51 accounts, 238 documented transactions. Vance emailed everything to the number Lena had given him for AUSM, Meredith Voss, at 11:43 at night. She called back at 7 the next morning. "We have the warrants," she said. "We are moving at 10 a.m. She paused. "Croft will be arrested wherever he is at 10. Judge Greer will be arrested in his courtroom. Rains is no longer a deputy as of 30 minutes ago. The sheriff didn't know, which tells you how carefully this was hidden from the people it should not have been hidden from." "What about Marsh?" Vance said. "Medical board has been notified. License suspended by end of day." Paxson. "He retained counsel last night, which means he already knew the walls were moving. His cooperation won't change the outcome. We have what we need without him." Vance stood in his kitchen in the early morning light. "There is something else," Voss said. "When we execute the warrant on Croft's office, we expect documentation of transfers beyond the original 47. His operation was more extensive than your witness knew. Current estimate is closer to 61 total transfers over the 7-year period." 61, Vance said. 61, she confirmed. He put his coffee down. 61 houses, 61 front porches, 61 gardens put to bed for winter by hands that would never tend them again. 61 people who had opened their doors to a man with a soft voice and a dead loved one's name, used like a tool. "What happens to the properties?" he asked. Most are recoverable, she said. The transfers were fraudulent, and the documentation of incapacitation through medication is solid. It will take time, but the mechanism is there. Harlan Briggs has been in a rented room since March, Vance said. He will be among the first, Voss said. He called Lena at 7:30, told her 10 o'clock, told her to stay where she was until he called her back. She was quiet for a moment. Is this really happening? She asked. At 10 o'clock, he said, yes. He heard her exhale, the long, slow kind that has been held for months. He drove to Nashville. He did not know exactly why he drove to Nashville instead of staying in Harlan County. Voss had not asked him to come. There was nothing operationally useful he could add to federal law enforcement executing a coordinated warrant. He was a man on a suspended sentence driving down a state highway on a Friday morning in December. But he thought it mattered to be somewhere that meant something when the thing finally came apart. He arrived at 9:47 and parked 3 blocks from the federal building and sat in the truck and watched the dashboard clock move to 10. At 10 o'clock on a Friday morning in December 2024, federal agents walked into the offices of Croft Senior Relief, LLC on Commerce Street in Harlan, Kentucky, and placed Silas Croft under arrest. He was sitting at his desk in his gray suit with a cup of coffee and a calendar that had 2 more weeks of appointments in it, none of which he would keep. He did not resist. He said nothing. He had the look of a man who had known this was coming and had decided that the only dignity left was to let it arrive without noise. Judge Alton Greer was on the bench when they came for him. Midway through a routine civil matter reading from a brief he held in both hands when the courtroom doors opened and 2 federal agents walked in and the entire room went still. Greer lowered the brief, took off his glasses. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of a thing for a long time and was finally being relieved of it. Dwight Paxson was taken from his firm's parking garage. Dr. Clifton Marsh was taken from the waiting room of his practice, surrounded by patients who would spend the rest of the day trying to understand what they had witnessed. Foster Raines was found at a motel in Corbin, 40 miles from Harlan, where he had been since Thursday, with a bag packed and not quite enough decisiveness to actually leave. Vance sat in the Nashville parking lot and let 10:15 become 10:30 and 10:30 become 11. He didn't call anyone. He didn't turn on the radio. He sat with the quiet and let it be what it was. At 11:20, he got out of the truck and walked to the federal building. Winnie was already there. Carol had driven her down from Cookville that morning. She was in a waiting room on the 3rd floor in a gray upholstered chair with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, wearing her blue cardigan and Harold's dog tags and the same careful composure she had maintained through all of it. When Vance walked in, she looked up and the composure held, but something underneath it shifted the way light shifts when someone opens a door. He sat down across from her. It happened, he said. She nodded. She already knew. Voss had told Carol 20 minutes ago. All of them, she said. All of them, he said. She looked at her untouched coffee. 61, she said. They told me 61. He said nothing. 61 people, she said quietly. And I was the one who happened to walk into a diner on the right Tuesday. You weren't just lucky, he said. You spent 3 months building the case in that phone. You walked into the diner on a Tuesday, but the photographs were already in your shoe before you got there. She looked at her hands for a moment. Harold always said I was too stubborn to ask for help, she said. He almost smiled. Voss came in 20 minutes later. She was compact and precise and had the air of someone who had been doing this long enough that the satisfaction of it had deepened from sharp to settled. She spoke to Winnie clearly and without condescension, covered the legal mechanics of what came next, answered her questions with patience and specificity. When she finished, she looked at Vance. Your financial documentation was the cleanest I have received in 11 years of federal prosecution, she said. Tell your associate, I will, Vance said. She excused herself. There was more work to do. Carol had gone to find lunch somewhere down the street. The building moved around them with the sound of people doing necessary things. Vance and Winnie sat in the waiting room. She looked at him across the space between the chairs. Why didn't you look away? She asked. In the diner, when everyone else did. He thought about how to answer it. He had been turning the question over since the Tuesday morning when it first became relevant, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the version of the answer that was true rather than the version that was comfortable. He pushed up his left sleeve, turned his wrist toward her. She looked at the name. David. My son, he said. He was 9 years old when he died. He died in 2011 on an afternoon I wasn't present for because of choices I had made that put me somewhere else. He looked at the name himself. That morning in the diner you came in and your shoe came off. You had dressed in the dark. I knew why immediately because my son used to do the same thing. He got dressed in the dark so he wouldn't wake me up, so he could keep himself safe from me. He stopped. I stood up because I saw a pair of mismatched shoes on a linoleum floor, and I was done being the man who looks away from what that means. Winnie was looking at him with the full weight of her attention, not with pity, with something older and more specific than pity. She reached up and took Harold's dog tags from around her neck. She had not taken them off once in 15 years. Not in any morning or evening and in 15 years of living alone in a house that still held the shape of someone else's presence. She leaned forward and placed them in his hand. He looked down at them, the worn metal, the name pressed into the surface in letters gone smooth from years of being touched. Sergeant Harold Gallagher, USMC. I can't take these, he said. You're not taking them, she said. I'm giving them to you. There is a difference. He looked at her. She was steady. The same steadiness she had carried through all of it, through 3 months of fog and fear, and a woman gathering evidence in silence with a dead man's phone. Harold gave his life so that men could come home, she said. Men exactly like you. He didn't do it because those men were perfect. He did it because they were worth saving. And what you did this week proved that he was right about that. Vance looked at the tags in his palm and said nothing. She is right, and it lands somewhere deep. The way things land when they are true, and you have been waiting to hear them without knowing you were waiting. I have been carrying Harold for 15 years, she said. He doesn't need carrying anymore. He is fine. He has been fine. I was the one who needed to believe I wasn't alone. She looked at Vance. I'm not alone, she said. I know that now. He closed his hand around the tags. The building moved around them, footsteps in hallways, a phone ringing somewhere, the sound of a door opening and closing at the end of a corridor. He sat with the tags in his hand and thought about David, about the October morning in the kitchen doorway, and a boy who had learned to move quietly through his own house. He thought about what it means to carry someone, about the weight of it and the necessity of it, and the point where carrying becomes holding on, and holding on stops being the same thing as love. He thought about what Winnie had just said. He is fine. He has been fine. I was the one who needed to believe I wasn't alone. He sat with that for a long time in the quiet of the waiting room. Then he put Harold's dog tags in his breast pocket, left side, over the place where his heart was. 2 men in that pocket now. One he had lost, one he had never met but who had mattered in ways that didn't require meeting. Carol came back with sandwiches. She talked about her kids, about Christmas being 3 weeks away, about whether Winnie would finally come to Cookville this year or continue her tradition of saying she would think about it. Winnie said she would think about it. Carol said that was the same thing she said every year. Vance ate his sandwich and listened to them talk and understood that he was watching something he didn't have a clean category for, the ordinary ongoing texture of a family that had come through something and was already finding its way back to the small, good things that make up a life. He was grateful to be in the room for it. He left before Carol drove Winnie back to Cookville. He stood in front of Winnie for a moment. She looked at him, he looked at her. There was nothing left that needed saying. Everything that needed to be said had been said in the waiting room while the building worked around them. He walked out of the federal building and down the 3 blocks to the parking lot. The Nashville afternoon was cold and clear. The sky a hard pale blue, the kind that comes after weather has moved through and left things clean. He called Lena. She picked up on the first ring. Is it done? She asked. It's done, he said. A silence on her end. The particular silence of someone absorbing something they have worked toward for a long time. My dad gets his house back, she said. Not a question. She said it to hear it in her own voice. He gets his house back, Vance said. She was quiet for a moment. The second porch, she said. He understood what she meant. The second porch too, he said. He heard her exhale, long and slow and finally. He started the truck and pulled out of the lot and turned north toward the highway. The afternoon light ran long and thin across Nashville, catching the windows of buildings that didn't know what had happened inside one of them this morning and wouldn't care if they did. Somewhere behind him, the federal building was full of people doing the work that follows the arrest, the filing, and the charging, and the careful documentation of a machine being taken apart piece by piece. He drove through it all and out the other side and onto the highway going north. The country opened up beyond the city, fields on both sides going brown and flat in the December light. The sky enormous in the way it gets when there's nothing left between you and the horizon. He had 14 miles to cover when he got back to Harlan County. 14 miles between the county line and the Ironwood Diner parking lot, where his Harley was still locked to a post patient as everything else it had waded through. He thought about Tuesday morning, about eggs he hadn't finished and coffee gone cold, about a bell above a door and a woman who had come in slow, and a shoe that had come off on a linoleum floor, and 20 people who had not stood up. He thought about whether he would do it again knowing everything it had cost. He didn't need long to answer that. He pulled into the Ironwood parking lot at 3:40 in the afternoon. Dottie Weaver was behind the counter when he walked in. The diner was half full, some of the same truckers from Tuesday, or different ones who looked the same. A couple of retirees, a young man near the window eating alone. Dottie looked up when the bell rang. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a plate covered in foil and set it on the counter. Eggs, she said. Kept them. Figured you would be back eventually. He sat down at the counter. He usually took the corner booth, but today the counter felt right. Easier to be in the room with people. Easier to sit somewhere that didn't have his back to everything. He ate the eggs. They were not bad for having been kept warm. Dottie was good at her job. When he was done, she refilled his coffee. It's over, she said. It wasn't a question. It's over, he said. She nodded. Wiped the counter with the slow, methodical motion of a woman who had wiped that counter 10,000 times and had found a kind of order in it. A reporter called this morning, she said. From the county paper. Wanted to know if I knew the biker who was in the diner Tuesday. What did you tell him, Vance said. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal from behind a counter and has her own ideas about which parts of it deserve to be repeated. I told him a man sat down his coffee, she said. That's all I saw. He sat down his coffee and he stood up. That's the whole story as far as I'm concerned. He looked at her. That's the whole story, he said. He paid for the eggs, left enough on the counter for the coffee and the trouble and the keeping of eggs warm for days on the chance he might come back. He put on his jacket and walked out through the door, the bell making its crooked, half-broken sound above him. The Harley was where he had left it, locked to the post. 4 days of cold and parking lot dust on the chrome. He unlocked it and straddled it and brought the engine to life. The sound of it filled the parking lot. Low and total, the kind of sound you feel in your chest before your ears register it. He sat for a moment with it running and the cold coming in, and the afternoon light going orange at the edges of the sky, the way it does in December, when the sun is already thinking about leaving. He put his hand over the left breast pocket of his jacket, felt the shape of the tags through the leather. Harold Gallagher had spent his life standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. He had done it until the last time he did it, which was the time it killed him. He had not done it because the people he stood up for were perfect, or grateful, or likely to remember. He had done it because it was the thing that needed doing, and he was the one who was present when it needed doing. Vance thought about that. He thought about David, about a boy who had dressed in the dark for reasons that were not that boy's fault, about the years Vance had spent trying to account for the person he had been during the years that mattered most, trying to pay a debt that couldn't be paid because the person he owed it to was gone. He had been carrying it wrong. That was what Winnie had shown him, without meaning to, or maybe meaning to in the way that certain women mean things without announcing them. He had been carrying David like a weight to be atoned for rather than like a name to be honored. He had been making himself small as a form of punishment when what was actually required was the opposite of small. David was fine. David had been fine for 13 years. Vance was the one who needed to stop treating the rest of his life like a sentence. He looked at the highway running north from the parking lot of the Ironwood Diner. 61 families were going to get phone calls in the coming weeks that would change what they thought was possible. Harlan Briggs was going to go back to Crawford Road and find out what condition the second porch was in. Winnie Gallagher was going to walk into her own kitchen on a Tuesday morning and know that the house she and Harold had bought in 1983 was still hers. Lena Briggs was going to drive her son Owen to see his grandfather in the house his grandfather had built. And at some point, Owen would be old enough to hear the story of what happened, and Lena would tell it to him the way it actually was. There was a lot of work still ahead, testimony to give, probation to finish serving, 11 months of careful living before the suspended sentence ran its course. A lot of Tuesday mornings at the Ironwood Corner booth, back to the wall eggs and black coffee, and the highway running outside the window in both directions. None of that seemed like a problem anymore. He put the Harley in gear. The engine rose and the exhaust came out white in the cold December air, and the chrome caught what was left of the afternoon light as he rolled out of the parking lot and turned north onto the county road. The fields ran flat on both sides. The sky was enormous. The cold came in through the leather and the scarf he had wound tight around his neck, and the general armor of a man who had ridden a lot of miles in weather worse than that and would ride a lot more. He had 14 miles home. He had Harold Gallagher over his heart. He had David on his wrist, which was not a debt anymore but a name. The name of a boy who had been worth something and whose father was finally figuring out what to do with that. He rode. The highway opened up and the engine settled into the long note it found on the open road, and the December light went from orange to red to the deep bruised purple that comes just before dark, and the fields and the bare trees and the distant houses, with their lights coming on, moved past him on both sides, like the whole world turning, and Vance Holden rode north through it with two good men in his pocket and the road ahead going as far as he could see.